for Black history, and I did a show earlier this month talking about Black history, and we'll be continuing in just a moment with that same theme. But first, I want to say something about a woman whom I really can't say I ever heard of before, but she sounds like a fascinating person. And she is associated with February 26th. Her name, Ethel Leginska, actually, apparently, she was Ethel Higgins, and she took a name for herself that made her sound perhaps more interesting. She was an English woman, but she took this name, which sounds sort of Polish or Eastern European, Leginska, and she was a musician. Actually, the 26th of February was her death date in the year 1970, at which time she was 83 years old. She was a piano prodigy as a child, which would have been in the late 1890s, but went on to become a concert pianist of a regular age and a married woman. She had a son, and that's mentioned in this because apparently she had a difficult divorce in which she lost her son to the husband, although she was, as I say, a concert pianist and apparently doing reasonably well monetarily, but still they gave the son to the father, and that was about the time of the First World War that she was active then. And Leginska wound up in the United States. She turned from being a concert pianist to being a conductor, which is even rarer. It's rarer to find a woman who is a conductor as opposed to a woman who is a solo pianist or a solo person who does some other kind of musical instrument. But it says that she did quite well as a conductor, and it mentions here that she conducted orchestras in Boston, Chicago, New York City, London, Munich, Paris, Havana, Dallas, and Berlin. So she had a rather active conducting career. And in addition, she organized women's orchestras in at least 3 American cities, the cities of Boston, New York, and Chicago. So I'm glad to have made the acquaintance of this woman who was a famous musician in the 20th century, passing away in 1970 by the name of Ethel Leginska. Now, I also want to talk about the upcoming International Women's Day Festival. International Women's Day is traditionally March 8th, and the month of March is Women's History Month, so it's a special time, in my thinking at least, of the year to remember women. This is the 7th year that Ohio University Women's Center, located on the 4th floor of the John Calhoun Baker University Center, the new big building at the end of Court Street, or perhaps the beginning, depending on which way you look, I suppose. And the Women's Center is organizing for the 7th year International Women's Day Festival. But since the actual Women's Day of March 8th occurs sort of right at the end of the spring break, the traditional Ohio University spring break during the second semester. They have chosen Sunday, March 15th to celebrate Women's Day. International Women's Day Festival will be on Sunday, March 15th in the afternoon from 2 to 6 at the Baker University Center Ballroom, which is also on the 4th floor, just sort of across from the Women's Center. They have planned quite a few activities as usual. Like I say, it's the 7th year that we've done it, and it's actually the 7th year that I've been on the planning committee, which has been getting ready for the festival coming up in mid-March. They have just recently started getting together all the people who have thus far volunteered, mostly Ohio University students and faculty, but including some community members as well, of which I have been representative on that committee. And so they have a list of performers who will be giving talks, singing songs, reading their poems, participating in fashion shows, various kinds of performers for March 15th afternoon of International Women's Day Festival. But in addition to performers, they need a number of other jobs done, and we have some volunteers already for setting up tables with displays of women's works, like organizations, especially women's students organizations from Ohio University, will have on display on these tables around the inside of the big ballroom, because we always need the whole thing. Ordinarily they can divide the ballroom into at least, I believe, 3 parts, but we'll have the whole thing on March 15th, and tables around inside the ballroom along the walls showing exhibits and displays by women's groups, especially student women's groups. And in the hall outside, which is going to be just across from the Women's Center, actually, on the other side of the building, on the eastern side of the building, the ballroom occupies the western part of the 4th floor of Baker Center. And in that hallway, there will be vendors selling various things, mostly women vendors, but there probably will be some men who are selling things that women would be interested in buying. I'm always glad to see the Girl Scouts there. Girl Scouts are just wrapping up their traditional Girl Scout cookie order time now, and will soon be delivering Girl Scout cookies. But they always have a big box or a couple of boxes of Girl Scout cookies available for sale at the International Women's Day Festival on March 15th this year. So we have vendors, including the Girl Scout cookies and many others, and we have volunteers who will be helping in the Women's Center itself, where I believe they are going to be having babysitting for the really little ones who come, who wouldn't be interested in watching performances in the ballroom, or perhaps their mothers would be involved with some of the doings at the festival. So we also have a part of the ballroom at the end where older children can be entertained and entertain themselves, with doing some art projects. So that's one of the things that some of the volunteers do, is help with the children's art projects there. And there are other things that need to be done, help and so on. So we have a number of volunteers, so there are quite a few women signed up to be volunteers already, I know. Now, if you are interested in participating as a performer or a vendor or a volunteer, you should be in contact with the Women's Center. You can give them a call at 593-9625 to find out how you might participate, or you can look them up on the internet. If you Google Women's Center, and you can find the application form, although the time is just passed for the deadline for that. I'm sure there will still be some places available if people haven't heard about it before and do want to participate. And actually the participation form that I filled out came from WUFOO, WUFOO, and I guess if you put that on your internet, you'd be able to come up with the International Women's Day Festival 2015 information. So do put that date on your calendar, March 15th. It is Sunday afternoon from 2 to 6 at a ballroom of Baker Center on the 4th floor for International Women's Day Festival. I'm myself planning, in the past I've talked about some well-known women of the past that I've been interested in for various reasons. I remember the very first one I spoke of was Frances Dana Gage, the 19th century women's rights and temperance and abolition promoter who was born in Washington County. And I believe her grandfather actually moved to Athens, the city of Athens, after Athens was set up in 1798. Frances Dana Gage herself was born in 1808 and was one of the very youngest children of the Barker family. Her mother was a Dana, and the Barkers and Danas came to Southeast Ohio in 1789, right off the bat, right after they founded Marietta. They were among the earliest settlers, and so on. Judge Florence Allen was another person I spoke about, and so I've had interesting women to talk about from history over the years. And this year, my person of interest will be a woman who was active in 1945. She was the only woman delegate at the writing of the Charter for the United Nations, and that would have been in the year 1945, as I say, in the spring. And then the charter was available for signing by the United Nations and was established on October 24th, 1945, which is a time that I remember. And I've always been interested in the United Nations and have visited there. And so the account given by Virginia Crocheron, I believe, Gildersleeve, Virginia Gildersleeve, Dean Virginia Gildersleeve of Barnard College in New York City, part of Columbia University, I'm going to be talking about her book, Many a Good Crusade. Fascinating book because she had a very interesting life from about 1877 when she was born in New York City, but with some both Northern and Southern America roots, and telling about many a good crusade in which she was active, including the International Federation of University Women, and the group that met for 5 years before the charter was written, a group meeting in New York City, which was considering what would need to be a part of a future international organization, because of course the League of Nations, founded after the First World War, did not succeed because of, well, it didn't. One of the reasons it did not succeed was because of the communist revolution, the fascist revolution, the Nazi revolution that occurred in the years between the end of World War I in 1918 and the outbreak of World War II in 1939. So I'm going to be speaking about Virginia Gildersleeve, and as I say, there will be many other performers and many different kinds of performances. A lot of fun. Very good afternoon on March 15th at Baker Center Ballroom in the afternoon. So now let's turn to some other parts of Black History Month, especially thinking of and concerned with Black women in history, whom I'm going to speak about, 7 or 8, I suppose, actually. Some of them are in my book, Remember the Ladies. Sojourner Truth is there. She was the one who, in a sense, was made famous by Frances Dana Gage, who wrote about her in the History of Women's Suffrage, when Gage wrote up that for the, in the 1880s, actually, that was actually published, and she had written earlier about Sojourner Truth's speech in Akron, often called Ain't I a Woman? And we just very recently had here at Ohio University the well-known Negro woman historian who sort of thinks that maybe she didn't actually say, ain't I a woman? However, in the contemporary accounts, as well as the account given by Frances Dana Gage 11 years after the event, there is very much similarity of things about which Sojourner Truth spoke. More about that anon. But I want to begin in a sort of a historical way by talking about earlier Black women in American history. And the first one dates from the 1690s. This is you know, history has all sorts of strange quirks, all sorts of strange things in it that you can find out about and learn about. And this woman was named Tituba, and she was a slave in New England. In fact, she lived in the town of Salem, Massachusetts in the 1690s. Well, that was a place where a very strange thing happened in the early 1690s. There was a big outbreak of witchcraft, or it was thought that there was witchcraft going on, and there were trials about witchcraft. There were people who were executed for witchcraft in Massachusetts in 1692, 1693. And Tituba was a part of this because she had been telling ghost stories and magic stories and so on to a group of relatively young girls there in Salem. just preteens and early teen girls, and they began doing very strange things. And there was the feeling that they were bewitched. And they said they were bewitched, and then they pointed to some of their townspeople who they said had bewitched them. It was a very strange sort of religious outbreak, but as I say, it became a very bad sort of thing for the people who were accused of witchcraft, a number of whom were actually executed. And that was a unique and famous incident in early American history in the 1690s. So Tituba, this black slave from the Caribbean who was living in Salem, Massachusetts, was one of the people who sparked this outbreak of religious extremism, really, at the time. And in fact, she was put in jail. She was condemned to death, but she was never executed. But what happened to her eventually was that since she couldn't buy her way out of jail, being a slave, she was sold. She was sold as a slave. I don't know that we know where it was she was sold to. I don't know that she was sold to the South because, of course, there was slavery in New England and New York State and so on until later in American history. The New York slaves were freed in the year 1827, one of whom was Sojourner Truth herself. Well, okay, how about Phyllis Wheatley? You know, my name is spelled W-H-E-A-L-E-Y, and a lot of people just can't understand that name. It's pronounced Whaley, like President Reagan pronounced his name, E-A as a long A. But people often think there's just a T missing, and so occasionally I get letters addressed to Lois Wheatley because they can't imagine that there is such a name as Whaley without it, and looks like Wheatley, so they just put the T in. Anyway, Phyllis Wheatley was a young African woman. I mean, she was born actually in Africa. She survived the terrible trip as a young child of age 7 to New England. And she was born about 1755, and she was sold in Massachusetts at age 7 in 1761 to a Quaker family, and this Quaker's name was Wheatley. So she was always known as Phyllis Wheatley. She was taught by her mistress, Mrs. Wheatley, to read and write, and she also learned Latin as well as English, of course, and she had been born into Africa, so she had an African native tongue. But she learned English so well that she became a poet. She published her first poetry when she was only 17 years old, and within a couple of years she had enough nice poems that she published no doubt the Wheatleys helped her publish the first book by an African American in what became the United States. She was a favorite of General George Washington. She sent him a nice poem, and which he accepted and was very pleased about. And then this book of poetry was published in England about in the 1770s. Unfortunately, she had a sad ending. Although her master freed her and she became a free black on his death. Her husband died early, and she had 3 children, and she had to become a servant, not a slave, but a servant in a household in Massachusetts, where she was treated so badly that she and her 3 children died of malnutrition, it is said, when she was only about 30 years old. So that was a really sad ending for the first publisher of a book by an African American in what became the United States, Phillis Wheatley, who died in about 1783. Well, let's see. Okay, now the next person I have down here is Sojourner Truth herself, who was born about 1797 in New York. And actually, it is thought that she was born in a little town not too far from New Paltz, which is the Huguenot founded, I guess you would say, founded town on the west side of the Hudson River, about 30 miles from Kingston, which is on the Hudson farther north. And it's a place I know well because I have Huguenot ancestors who were among the founders of New Paltz. And in the little town about 7 miles north of New Paltz called Rosendale, friends that my husband and I made when we lived in Maine way back when in the from 61 to 64, actually, our friends, the Nadells, still live in Rosendale, and when they were trying to sort of pin down where it was that Sojourner Truth was born, they finally decided it was probably in Rosendale, and they even have some ruins there that they think were the house that belonged to the master of Sojourner Truth, who was known in those days as Isabel. Sojourner Truth was a name that she took for herself later on when she became an itinerant preacher. But Sojourner Truth's first language was Dutch because, of course, up and down the Hudson River, there were many Dutch families. The Huguenots had been brought to America, actually, they say, in 1623, the first boatload on a Dutch ship of people from Europe came, and they were not Dutch people, as it turned out, but French people. French Huguenots who were Protestants, who were, and of course the major religion in France still continues to be Roman Catholicism. But the Huguenots were delivered to New York, they think to Staten Island, probably first, but eventually they went as far north as Albany, which at one time was called Orange, because the ruling family there in Holland, in the Dutch people, was the House of Orange. Anyway, Dutch was apparently Sojourner Truth's first language because she was born into this Dutch family on the Hudson River, or very close to the Hudson River. Well, she became an itinerant preacher in 1843, and as I said earlier, she had been freed when New York freed most of the slaves. Any of the ones born before 1800, at least, were freed in 1827. And then she went, she started on her missionary ideas in the 1840s, and it was in 1851 that she spoke in Akron at the Second Women's Rights Convention and where Frances Dana Gage was the chairwoman of the convention then, and she spoke up for the women and for women in general, pointing out that Christ was born of God and a woman, and man had nothing to do with that. And she said that because a minister there was telling the women, you shouldn't talk, women aren't supposed to talk. Jesus did not make any woman one of his disciples and so on. But I think that Sojourner Truth had a pretty good answer for that particular minister. Anyway, let's see, who else have we got here? Well, about the same age, really, as maybe even a little, well, certainly much younger than Sojourner Truth, because she was born about 1822, but she was born a slave in the South, in Maryland, and her name was Harriet Tubman. She became famous as a conductor, shall we say, on the Underground Railroad, because she made a number of trips to the South and helped slaves to escape. And that clandestine journey was on the so-called Underground Railroad, because they were people who were escaping from slavery in the South. But she made a number of trips, at least a dozen or more, and brought groups of slaves out of the South to freedom in the North. Harriet Tubman, the big conductor, very small actually, is just a tiny woman, really, and especially compared to Sojourner Truth, who was 6 feet tall, they say. But Harriet Tubman was the one who conducted the most famous of the trips on the Underground Railway. Now, she lived to be quite an old lady, so it was into the early 20th century before Harriet Tubman passed on. Now, another black woman who's someone that I have a special feeling for, special connection for, I believe, was Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Now, she was born a free black in Baltimore, Maryland. Her parents were free, and they died when she was very young, so she was raised by her uncle, who was a well-known educator. He was a black man who was a well-known educator in Baltimore for the free blacks. And so, his name was Harper. He was her father's brother, I believe. And so she had quite a good education to begin with. And then she had the good luck to be hired in the home of Quakers, who had quite a library. They had a big library for private people of those times. And they encouraged her to educate herself by reading widely in their library when her domestic tasks as a servant would permit, for her to read. So she became quite well educated, self-educated after she left the school of her uncle. Well, she became, this was Frances Ellen Watkins. Well, I should say her uncle was a Watkins, because Harper was her married name. And she was even hired as a lecturer for the anti-slavery group in Maine in the 1840s, 50s. And she became well known as a speaker and author. She wrote especially poems, but she wrote some plays, and when she was a pretty old person, actually, definitely middle-aged, in the 1890s, she wrote a novel called Iola Leroy, which is sometimes considered one of the first and better novels by an African-American woman. So Frances Ellen Watkins, the reason I came to know her and be interested in her was that she lived in Ohio for a time. Not very long, but she lived in Ohio for about 5 years. She, first of all, was first black woman teacher at a black college in Ohio. Probably this was to the south of Columbus, maybe over toward Dayton, actually. She taught sewing there, actually, but she was the first woman on their faculty of this black school. And it's later on joined with Wilberforce, which is a well-known black college traditionally over in the western Ohio area near Dayton. And then that was fairly early on, and she went on to do some more writing and lecturing. And then in 1860, she returned to Ohio, and she married an Ohioan, a man called Harper, who had a farm south of Columbus. They were married in Cincinnati, but he had this farm south of Columbus. And so she became a farm wife for several years. She had a daughter, but her husband died in 1864, and this, of course, was during the American Civil War. And she lost the farm, so she had to find another place to live and other things to do. And one of the things she did, especially after the Civil War, was to travel extensively around the South. It is said that she sold, or the publishers sold at any rate, the publishers sold some 50,000 copies of books by Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. So I thought that it would be good to enshrine her in the Ohio Women's Hall of Fame. Since she didn't meet the basic requirement is living for at least 5 years in the state of Ohio. And so in 2011, I put her name forward, and she was admitted to the Ohio Women's Hall of Fame. And the plaque, whatever you want to call it, the commemorative piece, is actually a piece of Toledo glass which has her name engraved on it. And it's wound up right here at Ohio University because Frances Ellen Watkins Harper had no direct descendants surviving. Her daughter never married, and she only had that one child. So I got the plaque, and it's currently in the Women's Center right here at Ohio University, which I think is quite appropriate because Dr. Susanna Dietzel, who is the chairwoman there at the Women's Center, is an expert on Frances Ellen Watkins Harper and wrote a chapter on her and her life for a book that was published when Dr. Dietzel was on the faculty down in New Orleans a number of years ago. So if you go to the Women's Center and look around at the bookcase and look on top into the bookcase, you'll probably see that little piece of solid glass which has the name of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper on it. Well, let's see, who do we have after Harper, who died in 1911, actually, so she was entered in the Hall of Fame, 100 years after her death. She died in Philadelphia. Well, Mary Church Terrell, I'm not sure of this pronunciation, I think it's Terrell. Mary Church Terrell is a person who has a connection with Ohio, and that connection is that she's a graduate of Oberlin College. Now, you know that Oberlin College up in the north of Ohio, very close to Lake Erie, but not on the lake itself, was founded in the 1830s by refugees from Cincinnati who set up shop up there in Oberlin, and they announced that they would have both women and blacks as students. And that was very unusual for the 1830s because there were no colleges for women in those days, and blacks often could not attend regular classes. Although we here at Ohio University are proud of the fact that John Templeton was, for whom the Memorial Auditorium is partially named. John Templeton was a graduate of Ohio University in the 1820s. In fact, some people say he was the fifth African-American man to receive a college degree in Ohio. Well, anyway, Oberlin was open to blacks and women, and Mary Church Terrell was one of their early graduates, and I happen to know another woman who graduated from, another black woman who graduated from Oberlin, who was in the field of music, and Oberlin is famous for its music school. That was my first piano teacher, who was an elderly black lady living in the mining town of Tonopah, Nevada, when I was a little girl of about 6 or 7 and first started piano lessons. And only recently did I learn that she had gone to Oberlin. And I notified them about that, and they looked her up, and sure enough, there she was, Mrs. Porter. I'm not sure what her name was before her marriage. Well, Mary Church Terrell was one of the founders of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs in the 1890s. And that was an organization with which Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was also associated. She was one of the first vice presidents of the National Association for Colored Women Clubs. And Mary Church Terrell was the first president of the group. She was a well-known educator. After her good education at Oberlin, she became a well-known black educator and the first president in 1896 of National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, which was a very successful women's group. One of the things that Mary Church Terrell wanted to emphasize was that to get away from this malicious notion that black women were, slaves and prostitutes and had been raped often, for that matter, by their white masters and so on, that they were not very good morally as women. Well, Mary Church Terrell knew that that was not true. There were many quite moral, good women as wives and mothers and sisters and so on, and that was one of the things that the National Association for Colored Women's Clubs always insisted upon was the good morality of good women, and good black women in particular, which was something that was very important to the feminist women like Mary Church Terrell, who founded that colored women's clubs, which are still active, you know. They are still active. And in 1914, they had 50,000 members across America, and they were larger than the NAACP or any of the other black groups. In 1914, they were definitely the largest black organization, the Colored Women's Clubs, with 50,000 members. Well, another woman who was came to attention in the 1890s first, really, was Ida B. Wells, and she was a journalist. Of course, by then it was after the Civil War, and just about after the coming of Jim Crow to the South, really, the Ku Klux Klan and so on, and lynchings began. Ida B. Wells was one of the people who spoke out most and wrote most about the evils of lynching. There was a newspaper article which I read just recently about a group which has tracked down the location of many of the sites of lynchings of black men, mostly, almost 4,000, nearly 4,000, from about 1870 to about 1930. People who were black men who were strung up, tortured often, some of them even burned alive, by lynching for, well, they were accused of doing various things, but they were accused, perhaps 1/3 of them were accused of rapes of white women, but the other 2/3 were accused of things like not getting off the sidewalk or being too uppity to white people or things like that. And the lynchings were, there was this particularly bad series of lynchings across northern states as well in the 1920s. Hard to imagine that people took children to these terrible things where men were lynched, killed, often for things that weren't even, quote, crimes, wouldn't have been even considered crimes, like being uppity and so on. But anyway, that was one of the evils of racism, which has been a scourge in our country for many a long year. And Ida B. Wells was the best known person who spoke out and wrote about and crusaded against the evils of lynching. Ida B. Wells in the 1890s. Well, let's see. Now, if we go on to more modern times, here's someone who's a very different kind of black woman, and thankfully one of these musical types, like my dear piano teacher, Mrs. Porter, and that is Marian Anderson, who was born in 1902. And I had the good luck of hearing Marian Anderson sing when I was a college student at Stanford. She came to San Francisco and sang at the San Francisco Opera House. And my friend and I went up to sit in the, highest bit of the hall, because that's where the cheapest seats were. And we heard Marian Anderson sing. And amazingly, I think it's because they have such great acoustics at that auditorium at the San Francisco Opera, that we could hear these pianissimo endings to some of the beautiful songs that she sang. She sang both well-known art songs by European composers, and she also sang a number of beautiful Negro spirituals, because the black people are noted, as we know from the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., noted for their spirituality and religiosity. Many of them are. So that was one of the things I most remember from hearing her sing, was this pianissimo that you could hear in the very last row of the opera. I think maybe she sang, "My Lord, what a morning." That it might have been that spiritual, which is actually the title, I believe, of her autobiography. And you know, she sang here at Ohio University. If you go over to Memorial Auditorium and look at those plaques over there by Memorial Auditorium on the western side, you know, there are, I don't know, maybe 20 plaques now. Most of them are of white men, obviously, you know, famous people who visited Athens over the years, like President Theodore Roosevelt, President Eisenhower, President Lyndon Johnson, you know, people like that. But there are a few new ones, and among the new ones is the plaque to Marian Anderson, who sang here, I believe, about 1950, when John Calhoun Baker was new president of Ohio University. So Marian Anderson, you know, made her name as contralto. She was the first black American woman to sing at the Metropolitan Opera, to have a regular, you know, position, a regular paid position at the opera. That was actually kind of toward the end of her singing career. She was born in 1902. If she sang here in 1950, she would have been 48, and I think she was like 1955 when she sang at the Metropolitan Opera in New York City. But anyway, there are a number of women over the years, black women of all sorts, some in the arts, some had been slaves, some were well known for their writings, some had tragic lives, and some we remember quite well, like Sojourner Truth, and others that we need to hear about, like Phyllis Wheatley. And so I'm sort of ending up this this session on February 26th, toward the end of Black History Month. I'm not entirely done talking, of course, but I'm probably done talking about our well-known black women over the years, that just a few of some of the more famous black women over the years. But I want to mention that in this Unitarian Universalist UU World, it's called, they have several interesting articles in this particular issue. In fact, they have two takes on the Selma movie that I talked about in my last session done on February 3rd, about Selma and the march, the Selma March, which we will soon be, well, celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Selma March, which occurred during the month of March 1865. And I have to correct myself at this point too, because somehow I had had the impression that Jimmie Lee Jackson, the black young man who was killed by an Alabama trooper, was killed at the march on March 7th, where 600 people, that was a Sunday, was called Bloody Sunday. Actually, he was killed the previous month in another area close to Selma, but not right in Selma. And the march on the 7th of March, 1965, was in commemoration, in part, of his death at the hands of an Alabama trooper in February 1965. But that march was the Bloody Sunday one that resulted in a number of people being beaten up for trying to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge and go to Montgomery. Then on March 9th, that was the one led by Martin Luther King, where they crossed the bridge, they knelt, and then he led the people back. They didn't try to go on to Montgomery on the 9th. And it was that night that the Reverend James Reeb, Unitarian Universalist from Massachusetts, was beaten up so badly that he died a couple of days later, which was one of the big impetuses for the Lyndon Johnson calling for a Voting Rights Act that would protect blacks who wanted to vote, especially in the South, which was proposed in mid-March 1965, and then the final march, which made it all the way to Montgomery over the course of 5 days, beginning on the 21st of March 1965, and in which over 20,000 people finished the march. Some people joined on the road to Montgomery, which is about 50 miles, you know. So that's coming up, and we will be seeing, I think, soon some more about remembering the march to Montgomery in March, the month of March, 1965, 50 years ago. So we're getting right down to the end. Let me remind everybody again about International Women's Day Festival on March 15th, which is a Sunday. It's going to be at Baker Center Ballroom, Sunday afternoon from 2 to 6. And if there are people out there, women who want to be involved in performing or tabling or vending at that event, please be in touch with the Women's Center, the 4th floor of Ohio University Baker Center. And this is Women Today and Yesterday with Lois Whaley, your hostess or host, as the case may be, signing off now.